Paul Graham gave a talk titled "Before the Startup," in which he tells students what he would tell his own kids about startups. Now, I'll link the actual talk down below in Canvas if you'd like to watch it from him, but there are a few swear words in it, and in this version, I've shortened or condensed it down a little for you as well. So whichever you choose to watch, you should get the main points out of either. But here it is. Startups are very counterintuitive, and I'm not sure exactly why. It could be simply because knowledge about them has not permeated our culture yet. But whatever the reason, this is an area where you cannot trust your intuition all the time. It's like skiing in that way. When you first try skiing and you want to slow down, your first impulse is to lean back, just like at everything else. But lean back on the skis and you fly down the hill out of control. So part of learning to ski is learning to suppress that impulse. Eventually you get new habits, but in the beginning, there is this list of things that you're trying to remember as you start down the hill. Alternate feet, make S-turns, don't drive the inside foot, all this stuff. Startups are as unnatural as skiing, and there is a similar list of stuff you have to remember for startups. What I'm going to give you today is the beginning of the list. The list of the counterintuitive stuff you have to remember to prevent your existing instincts from leading you astray. The first thing on it is the fact that I just mentioned startups are so weird that if you follow your instincts, they will lead you astray. If you remember nothing more than that, when you're about to make a mistake, you can pause before making it. So why do founders persistently ignore partners' advice? That's the thing about counterintuitive ideas. They contradict your intuitions. They seem wrong, so of course your first impulse is to ignore. You don't need people to give you advice that does not surprise you. If founders' existing intuition gave them the right answers all the time, they wouldn't need mentors and partners. You can, however, trust your instincts about people. Your life so far hasn't been much like starting a startup, but all the interactions you've had with people are just like the interactions you have with people in the business world. In fact, one of the big mistakes that founders make is to not trust their intuition about people enough. They meet someone who seems impressive, but about whom they feel some misgivings. And then later, when things blow up, they say, I knew there was something wrong about that guy, but I ignored it because he seemed so impressive. So when you meet people who seem smart, but somehow distasteful, you think, okay, this must be normal for business, but it's not. Just pick people the way you pick friends. This is one of those rare cases where it works to be self-indulgent. Work with people you would generally like and respect and that you have known long enough to be sure about, because there are a lot of people who are really good at seeming likable for a while. Just wait till your interests are opposed and then you'll see. The second counterintuitive point is that in order to succeed in a startup, you don't need to be an expert in startups. That makes this class different from most other classes you take. You take a French class. At the end of the semester, you learn how to speak French. You do the work. You may not sound exactly like a French person, but pretty close, right? This class can teach you about startups, but that is not what you need to know. What you need to succeed in a startup is not expertise in startups. What you need is expertise in your own users. That's what this entrepreneurship class is geared towards: customer discovery. Mark Zuckerberg did not succeed at Facebook because he was an expert in startups. He succeeded despite being a complete noob at startups. Facebook was first incorporated as a Florida LLC. He succeeded despite being a complete noob at startups because he understood his users very well. In fact, I worry it's not merely unnecessary for people to learn in detail about the mechanics of starting a startup, but possibly somewhat dangerous, because another characteristic mistake of young founders starting startups is to go through the motions of starting a business. They come up with some plausible sounding idea, they raise funding to get a nice valuation, then the next step is to rent a nice office and hire a bunch of their friends. until they gradually realize how completely sunk they are, because while imitating all the outward forms of starting a business, they have neglected the one thing that is actually essential, which is to make something people want. Paul said he saw this happen so often that he made up a name for it: playing house. Eventually, he realized why it was happening. The reason young founders go through the motions of starting a startup is because that is what they've been trained to do their whole life up to this point. Think about what it takes to get into college. Extracurricular activities? Check. Even in college classes, most of the work you do is as artificial as running laps. And I'm not attacking the educational system for being this way. Inevitably, the work that you do to learn something is going to have some amount of fakeness to it. And if you measure people's performance, they will inevitably exploit the difference to the degree that you're measuring is largely an artifact of fakeness. So it's not surprising that after being effectively trained for their whole lives to play such games, young founders' first impulse on starting a startup is to find out what the tricks are for this new game. What are the extracurricular activities of startups? What are the things I have to do? They always want to know, since apparently the measure of success for a startup is fundraising, another rookie mistake. They always want to know what are the tricks for convincing investors. And we have to tell them that the best way to convince investors is to start a startup that is actually doing well, meaning growing fast, and then simply telling your investors so. Then they ask, okay, so what are the tricks for growing fast? And this is exaggerated by the existence of this term, growth hacks. Whenever you hear somebody talk about growth hacks, just mentally translate it in your mind to bullcrap. Because what we tell them is that the way you make your startup grow is to make something that users really love, and then tell them about it. So that's what you have to do. That's the growth hacks right there. So this is the third counterintuitive thing to remember about startups. Starting a startup is where gaming the system stops working. Gaming the system may continue to work if you go to work for a big company, depending on how broken the company is. You may be able to succeed by sucking up to the right person, giving the impression of productivity by sending emails late at night, or if you're smart enough, changing the clock on your computer, because who's checking the headers? But in startups, that does not work. There's no boss to trick. How can you trick people when there is nobody to trick? There are only users, and all users care about is whether your software or product does what they want, right? They're like sharks. You can't wave a red flag and fool it. It's like meat or no meat. You have to have what people want, and you only prosper to the extent that you do. The dangerous thing is that faking does work to some extent with investors. If you're really good at knowing what you're talking about, you can fool investors for 1, maybe 2 rounds of funding, but it's not in your best interest to do so. I mean, you're all doing this for equity. You're pulling a confidence trick on yourself, wasting your own time because the startup is doomed and all you're doing is wasting your time writing it down. So stop looking for the trick. There are tricks in startups as there are in any domain, but they are an order of magnitude less important than solving the real problem. Someone who knows zero about fundraising but has made something users really love will have an easier time raising money than someone who knows every trick in the book but has a flat usage graph. Though, in a sense, it's bad news that gaming the system stops working now, in the sense that you're deprived of your most powerful weapons, and after all, you spent 20-some years mastering them. I find it very exciting that there even exists parts of this world where gaming the system is not how you win. It's time to realize that there are parts of the world where gaming the system matters less than others. In some places, it hardly matters at all. But there are, and this is one of the most important things about when planning your future. And how do you win at each type of work? And what do you want to win by doing it? This brings us to our fourth counterintuitive point. Startups are all-consuming. If you start a startup, it will take over your life to a degree that you cannot imagine. And if it succeeds, it will take over your life for a long time, for several years at the very least, and maybe a decade, maybe the rest of your working life. So there's a real opportunity cost here. It may seem to you that Larry Page has an enviable life, but there But there are parts of it that are definitely unenviable. The way the world looks at him is that he started running as fast as he could at age 25 and has not stopped to catch his breath since. Every day, stuff happens within the Google empire that only the emperor can deal with, and he, as the emperor, has to deal with it. If he goes on vacation for even a week, a whole backlog of stuff accumulates, and he has to bear this, uncomplaining, because number one, as the company's founder, he cannot show fear or weakness. And number two, if you're a billionaire, you get zero. No, actually less than zero sympathy if you complain about having a difficult life. Which has this strange side effect that the difficulty of being a successful startup founder is concealed from almost everyone who has done it. People who win a 100-meter in the Olympics, you walk up to them and they're out of breath. Larry Page is doing that too, but you never get to see it. Founders will say it never gets any easier. The nature of the problems change, so you may be worrying about more glamorous problems like construction delays in your new London offices rather than the broken air conditioner in your studio apartment. But the total volume of worry never decreases. If anything, it increases. Starting a successful startup is similar to having kids. It's like a button you press and it changes your life irrevocably. Yet when it comes to starting startups, a lot of people seem to think that they are supposed to start them in college. So, can universities teach you about startups? Well, if not, what are we doing here? So the answer is yes and no. As I've explained to you about startups, essentially, if you want to learn French, universities can teach you linguistics. That is what this is. This is linguistics. We're teaching you how to learn languages, and what you need to know is how to speak a particular language. We'll also start you on the path of customer discovery in a business idea. What you need to know are the needs of your users. You can't learn those until you actually start the company, which means that starting a startup is something you can intrinsically only learn by doing it. You can't always do that in college for the reason I just explained. Startups take over your entire life. Should you do it at any age? Starting a startup may sound kind of hard. If I haven't made that clear, let me try again. Starting a startup is really hard. If it's too hard, what if you're not up to this challenge? That answer is the fifth counterintuitive point. You can't tell. Your life so far has given you some idea of what your prospects might be if you wanted to become a mathematician or a professional football player. Unless you have had a very strange life, indeed, you have not done much that's like starting a startup, meaning starting a business will change you a lot if it works out. So what you're trying to estimate is not just what you are, but what you could become. And who could do that? Seriously, it's easy to tell how smart people are in 10 minutes. The hard part, and the most important part, is predicting how tough and ambitious they would become. Paul Graham said he learned from experience to keep a completely open mind about which startups in each batch would turn out to be the stars. The founders sometimes thought they knew. Some arrived feeling confident that they would ace everything. Others, not so much. There is little to no correlation between these attitudes and how things turn out. I've read the same is true in the military. The swaggering recruits are no more than likely to turn out to be really tough than the quiet ones, and probably for the same reason. The tests are so different from tests in people's previous lives. If you are absolutely terrified of starting a business, you probably shouldn't do it. Otherwise, you are merely unsure of whether you're going to be able to do it, and the only way to find out is to try. So, if you want to start a startup one day, what do you do now in college? There are only two things you need initially: an idea and co-founders. The MO for getting both of these is the same, which leads us to our sixth and last counterintuitive point. Make sure you have an idea that could actually be worthwhile startup. 1. Learn about a lot of things that matter. 2. Work on problems that interest you. And 3. With people you like or respect. And 3. With people that you like and or respect. That's the third part, incidentally, is how you get co-founders at the same time as the idea. History is full of examples of young people who were working on problems that no one else at the time thought were important, in particular, that their parents didn't think were important. On the other hand, history is even fuller of examples of parents that thought their kids were wasting their time and who were right. Strangely enough, the optimal thing to do in college if you want to be a successful startup founder is not some new vocational version of college focused on entrepreneurship. It's the classic version of college. It's education for its own sake. If you want to start your own startup, what you should do in college is learn powerful things. And if you have genuine intellectual curiosity, that's what you'll naturally tend to do if you just follow your own inclinations. At its best, starting a startup is merely an ulterior motive for curiosity, and you'll do it best if you introduce the ulterior motive at the end of the process. So here's the ultimate advice for young students, would-be startup founders, reduced to 2 words: just learn.